Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamersHead.com video, we're going to be discussing Sony and their recent relationship with indie developers. So, before we get into this too much, let's talk for a moment about indie developers. It's very, very easy to look at the big games that are being released right now. For example, Metro, of course, Far Cry Blood Dragon, and so on, and get really caught on those games and forget about the smaller indie titles. There are a couple of really big ones in my mind that really stand out. Amnesia, of course, and other titles like, for example, Thomas Was Alone, which is a very imaginative title. I encourage you guys to pick it up. Hotline Miami, of course, and so on. The bottom line is, when you look at indie developers, they are a breeding ground for raw talent. However, it's very, very hard for them, at least traditionally in the past, to make themselves known on a platform other than PC. Consoles have been notoriously difficult to develop for, and to be honest with you, most of the time they just stick with PC, and if they are quite lucky and their product is popular enough, maybe they'll, for example, get Steam Greenlight, and then they may well go on to become quite popular. However, there's a reality. Consoles themselves need more than just the really big hits to sell. And in today's market, of course, it's becoming increasingly competitive, particularly when you start looking at smartphone applications and so on as well. When you start looking at just how well smartphone, as well as tablet and all these other devices are starting to sell, you can see that, well, you need to really start expanding your own market. And Sony are really starting to try to woo and wine and dine indie developers. This has been said a couple of times, and one of the ways they've done this, of course, is to design the PlayStation 4 in a completely different way. They've made an x86 architecture, they've made it with oodles of memory, and more of a PC kind of design overall. The simple reason, because of course a lot of PC developers are, well, used to PC design. And most of the indie developers, of course, are used to PC architecture. This also helps bigger studios as well develop a lot easier. Secondly is that they've wrote a lot better APIs, but more than that, more than just the hardware, they're also giving a lot of personal support, and by which I mean that they are being a very reachable company and working a lot better with the studios. Right now, Sony are basically reaching out to developers. They look at developers who have a track record of success or a game that is pretty hot property, and then they contact them and say, hey, we'd really like to have this game on our system. It's smart and simple. It's not particularly a complicated business decision, but it's a very smart business decision. Now, I'm pretty bad at pronouncing names, as a couple of you have gestured, and to be fair, I am. However, Shahid Ahmad, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, is the man who is working with a lot of these indie developers, and he seems to be regularly mentioned as well in their comments. Shahid actually contacted the developer of Super Crate Box, and responsible largely for bringing that to the Vita, and even Devolver Digital, who of course were developers of Hotline Miami as well. I'm going to read you guys a direct quote. What's changed is that there are many more great games. All we've done is recognize that and try to make it easier than ever to make games on the PlayStation platforms. It's about hiding process behind the people instead of hiding people behind some process. In case you're wondering, and this is out of quote, in case you're wondering what he actually means by that, this is a bit difficult to maybe understand what he means. He's basically talking about he wants to push developers to the forefront. I released another video just a couple of days ago which was talking about the PSN and how they've actually added a dedicated channel, if you will. This is going to be serving to highlight some of the best indie games out there. And it's a smart move, because if you can start to make these indie developers stars, then you're basically increasing not only their portfolio and making them much more likely to sell games, but more to the point as well, you are doing the same thing for Sony as well. Thomas Was Alone's creator, Mike Bettles, actually went on record and was discussing this. He said, Shahid played Thomas early on, and then they got talking on Twitter. I think in my case, the differentiator was the game was not on any consoles already, so the audience was unaware of it. We tend to assume a far greater overlap between PC and console gamers than there actually is, and until last week there was an enormous audience of console players who had not even heard of my games. End quote. Once again, this is just to illustrate from Sony and, well, the developers themselves that it's very, very weird, because a lot of the time PC gamers themselves may not really be aware of a certain game. For example, I've got a couple of friends who don't really play PC games that much, and sometimes I'll ask them, hey, have you seen this new trailer for X on the PC? And they look at me really blankly, actually. And I think that's the same for for PC gamers as well. If you think about it, you don't really research that heavily into systems that you don't own. It's not because you're jealous of their games or anything like that. It's just simply that you don't own it, you're not interested. Therefore, by extension, you just don't really think to even concern yourself with the games. So Sony seems to care. That's actually one of the quotes from Vlambeer's Rami Ismail. God, I'm probably pronouncing some of these names incredibly wrong. Anyway, what proof is there that Sony cares? I hear you scream from the rooftops. Well, apparently there's actual evidence of this. His own actual Vita, he was actually using to demo their game, Super Crate Box, on the Expo floor last year, was actually stolen. And therefore, Shahid actually gave him his own personal Vita, so he could actually continue to show and demo the game for people. And I'll continue reading the quote. That's really all. In the end, we're not Vlambeer interacting with Sony. We're two guys making games, talking to a human being that tries to bring out gamers to Sony. If we get the feeling that people we work with care about what we do and are capable of making things happen, we'll be way more interested in working with their company. Coming off of quote for a second, another thing that terrified indie developers, terrified is a completely wrong word, but certainly put off, is the stringent requirements for developing for a console. In other words, you are very much down to their whims. And of course, not only do you sometimes have to pay publishing fees and all the other good stuff that you would expect, but there were also, of course, strict deadlines and paid patches, and indeed, Rami actually continued in his quote and said, "We think that the main thing that's changed is really Sony becoming a lot more open to experimenting with new content to their systems. The old ways of doing business, pushing for exclusivity, strict deadlines, paid patches, those days are gone." Off quote for a second, if you think about this, it actually makes perfect sense. If you are a company that is extremely easy to work with, by default, you are going to elicit more business. Let's face it, if you are a kinder and more caring company, and I don't really like the way that came across as in kind of frilly and lovey-dovey, but I just usually, it's very true when you think about it. If you're easy to work with, if you are supportive, if you are able to help your developers, it's quite a simple case that those developers are going to want to reciprocate and say, hey, you guys made the process of actually porting this game or developing this game. For example, it could be an exclusive game that they originally were developing specifically for that system. Or it could be a title that was, say, on the PC, and they say, you know what, I want to port this on to say, the PlayStation because I want a wide audience. If Sony are willing and able and happy to work with that developer to get the most out of the hardware, then, and more to the point, to make the actual porting process itself, as in the actual contracts and negotiations and everything else, if they're quite willing and open with all of this, it makes the company that much more likely to stick with Sony for upcoming expansions. More to the point, when you think about it, it also means that the actual games themselves are most likely going to sell a hell of a lot better, because poor ports are one of the reasons, of course, that games sell poorly. So, I know what you're going to say, what about Microsoft in all of this? Well, as always, it's hearsay and their own personal takes and so on. By which I mean that it could be friction between a developer and Microsoft, it could be personal issue, and so on. However, Microsoft right now are having issues with apparently indie developers. Jonathan Blow, I'm sorry, who actually helped develop, or actually was the developer of Braid, and as well as The Witness, which of course is coming out on the PlayStation 4, said, and I quote, that Microsoft treats independent developers very badly, and then said they pull you through as much pain as you will endure in order to extract whatever they feel like this week. On the other hand, Microsoft have actually responded somewhat to this and have quoted in saying, Microsoft is investing in helping developers realize their visions on Xbox by ensuring they have the tools they need to become successful and using their feedback to continually make refinements. Okay, so that's just one developer, right? What about others? Well, Retro City Rampage as well, the developer Brian Provinciano were talking to Wired, and during that he said that dealing with Sony was, and I quote, a coffee shop chat, while Microsoft seemed to be intimidating and corporate vibe. Anyway, he then claimed that he was vocal about the problems dealing with Microsoft, and so they actually cancelled the planned release of Retro City Rampage on Xbox Live, and then, and I quote, forced him to resubmit the game through an arduous approval processes and go through an extra 6 months of negotiations that required him to submit the game through an outside publisher to get it released. Ouch! So that stings, right? And then Microsoft apparently accidentally sold the game for $10 rather than the planned $15. And so that ate into his profits even further. Obviously, he was not a happy camper. You may remember from a Wii U video yesterday that I released talking about the difficulties of getting Frostbite free on the Wii U. In other words, it's pretty much impossible. That Avalanche Studios founder was talking about Nintendo and said that, well, he found the company difficult to reach, and this is another problem. Both of these companies are actually really upsetting indie developers. And while it might not seem a particularly big deal to you, you might say to me, well, what difference does an indie developer make? They might sell, 1 million copies or 500,000 copies. The bottom line is, that's very true. And I'll completely, utterly grant you that most indie games do not sell particularly amazingly. But then you get the big games. Then you get Minecraft. Then you get Amnesia. Then you get Trine. I've actually covered one of the Trines. I think it was expansion on this channel. And of course, Martyrs regularly cover most of the third-party mods for Amnesia. There's no way you can tell me that a game like Minecraft or Terraria or Trine and these other games have not massively influenced gaming. And the bottom line is, sure, there are a lot of titles that I really wish I hadn't have played that are indie, but then at the same time, there are a hell of a lot of titles that I wish I hadn't have played that were full £40 release games as well, to be honest with you. In other words, indie doesn't necessarily mean a lower quality of game. It just usually means that, they had to make the game slightly shorter, or, the graphics aren't quite as great, or they couldn't afford, the best voice acting in the world, or whatever, because obviously they are working on a smaller budget. However, the gameplay and the actual game itself is still fantastic. And I know I've talked about Amnesia quite a bit, but I just want to really hammer the point into the ground a little bit more. One of the reasons that I think games like Amnesia are doing so well on the PC is the modability. Now, obviously, this doesn't enjoy the same level on the PlayStation, although to be fair, we don't know just how moddable the games will be on the next PlayStation. Depends, obviously, on the toolkits and so on that they decide to bundle with it. Regardless, as I was saying, when you look at something like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and of course its sequel as well, you're basically got a game here that created a cult following. And the same thing, of course, for Minecraft. I mean, YouTube channels have been made purely for Minecraft content, and I'll be honest, it's not my thing. No offense to those who really enjoy it, it's just not something I've really decided to sink my time into. But, you know, millions do. It's that simple. And so, from the very simple fact of the matter is, you do not know how well an indie game is going to do. So, when you're basically making it difficult and an arduous process to release that content on your own system, to me, it's just shooting yourselves into the foot. Now, obviously, that has to be a... what's the best way of saying this? There has to be a happy medium. In other words, you can't just say, well, anything's welcome, because then, of course, you've got quality assurance issues. You know, you have to make sure that the system's not going to hardlock the, you know, become hardlocked if this runs, or, I don't know, it's going to delete, say, save data or whatever. Although, to be fair, a few full-price releases have done the same thing. You see where I'm going with this? So, really, I'll be honest with you, I'm not saying that Sony are going to have a huge feather in their cap with this whole situation, but it is becoming to the point now where indie games are no longer really basic, they are becoming a lot bigger. Anyway, I think that's about it. I think I've said my piece, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I will hopefully see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.